Paula Weldon's red coat blazed like a cardinal against the November snow as she stepped onto Vermont's long trail, her Bennington College dorm mates watching from their window until the forest swallowed her whole. That crimson flash on December 1st, 1946, would be the last anyone ever saw of the 18-year-old sophomore. This isn't just another missing person case, it's the centerpiece of America's most baffling cluster of disappearances, where 5 people vanished without explanation in a region that would become known as the Bennington Triangle. The morning started ordinarily enough. Paula had mentioned to her roommate that she wanted to take a long walk, maybe do some hiking to clear her head before finals. She'd been restless lately, struggling with the social pressures of college life and feeling disconnected from her studies. The crisp December air seemed to call to her as she pulled on that distinctive red coat, a Christmas gift from her parents that would later become a haunting detail seared into local memory. She caught a ride partway up the mountain with a local couple who remembered her cheerful demeanor and the way she clutched her leather purse against the cold. They dropped her at the Long Trail's southern terminus near Route 9, where weathered wooden signs marked the beginning of Vermont's most famous hiking path. The trail stretched 272 miles north to the Canadian border, threading through some of New England's most unforgiving wilderness. But Paula wasn't planning an epic journey. She told the couple she'd just walk a few miles up the mountain and turn back before dark. The trail here was well marked, ascending gradually through mixed hardwood forest where bare maples and birches stood like gray sentinels against the early winter sky. Fresh snow crunched beneath her feet as she disappeared around the first bend. What happened next depends on who you ask, but the timeline grows increasingly disturbing. A local contractor working on a nearby property claimed he saw a young woman in a red coat walking the trail around 2:30 that afternoon. A hunting party reported glimpsing someone matching Paula's description near the Bickford Hollow area, the same remote valley where another hiker had vanished just 13 months earlier. Then the sightings stopped completely when Paula failed to return to her dormitory that evening. Her friends initially weren't worried. College students disappeared for romantic encounters or spontaneous adventures all the time. But as midnight passed with no word, concern crept in like the mountains gathering cold. By dawn, when she missed her morning classes, panic set in. The Bennington County Sheriff's Department launched what would become one of Vermont's largest search operations to that point. More than 1,000 volunteers combed the mountainside for 5 grueling days. They found nothing. No torn fabric, no dropped belongings, no footprints in the snow beyond those initial tracks that simply ended at a stream crossing 3 miles up the trail, as if Paula had simply stepped into the water and dissolved. The case's mishandling was spectacular. Sheriff's deputies contaminated the crime scene, failed to coordinate with state authorities, and even lost crucial evidence. The public outcry was so intense that the Vermont legislature was forced to create the state police force 7 months later, a direct response to the bungled investigation that let Paula Weldon slip through the cracks of rural law enforcement. But here's what makes Paula's disappearance truly chilling. She wasn't the first person to vanish on this mountain, and she wouldn't be the last. Her case occurred in the exact middle of a 5-year window when the Glastenbury mountain region seemed to be consuming people whole, one by one, with methodical precision. The locals had a name for the area long before folklorists coined the term Bennington Triangle. The Abenaki tribes who once hunted these peaks called the summit the place where the 4 winds meet, and warned their people that the mountain was cursed, home to a man-eating stone that devoured travelers who dared climb too high. Modern skeptics dismiss such folklore as primitive superstition, but they struggle to explain why Paula Weldon, a bright, capable young woman on a well-traveled trail in broad daylight, could simply cease to exist. No animal attack, no evidence of foul play, no logical explanation that fits the physical evidence. The red coat haunts everything that follows. Locals began whispering that the mountain had somehow been angered by that splash of color against its winter palette, that Paula had unknowingly triggered something ancient and hungry in those brooding peaks. What they didn't know yet was that another person in a red coat would vanish from this same region exactly 4 years later, under circumstances that would make Paula's disappearance seem almost ordinary by comparison. Before we dive deeper into this mystery, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. If this story has already grabbed you, hit that like button and subscribe, because the Bennington Triangle is just getting started. But first, we need to understand what made this particular patch of Vermont wilderness so hungry for human lives, and why the mountain seemed to be collecting its victims with the patience of a predator that knew it had all the time in the world. 74-year-old Mitty Rivers could navigate the Glastenbury mountain wilderness blindfolded, his weathered hands reading the landscape like Braille as he led hunting parties through terrain that had claimed lesser guides for decades. On November 12, 1945, this master of the mountain stepped into Bickford Hollow and vanished as completely as morning mist. Rivers' disappearance would establish the template for everything that followed experienced outdoorsmen, swallowed by familiar territory under impossible circumstances. The old guide had been leading 4 hunters from Massachusetts through the dense hardwood forests above Glastenbury when they decided to split up for the afternoon hunt. Rivers, carrying his trusted .30-30 Winchester and wearing his signature red and black wool jacket, headed toward a ridge he'd traversed hundreds of times before. The plan was simple: circle back to meet the group at their predetermined rendezvous point by 4 o'clock. 4 o'clock came and went, then 5. By 6, with November darkness swallowing the mountainside, the hunters began calling Rivers' name into the gathering gloom. Their voices echoed off the granite ledges and returned empty, carrying only the whisper of wind through bare branches and the distant crack of settling ice. What made Rivers' disappearance so unsettling wasn't just that he'd vanished, it was that he'd vanished from territory he knew better than his own backyard. This was a man who'd been guiding hunters through these mountains since the turn of the century, who could identify every deer path and stream crossing with his eyes closed. Local newspaper accounts described him as someone who never got lost, not even in the worst blizzards. The search that followed dwarfed anything Vermont had seen before. More than 300 volunteers poured into the wilderness, joined by Vermont State Guard troops and soldiers from Fort Devens in Massachusetts. They formed human chains that swept every hollow, climbed every ridge, and probed every thicket where a man might have fallen or taken shelter. For 5 days, the mountains rang with the sound of searchers calling Rivers' name. Bloodhounds brought in from the state police followed scent trails that led nowhere, circling back on themselves or simply ending at rock outcrops where no human could have disappeared. Aircraft buzzed overhead, their pilots scanning the canopy for any flash of movement or color that might indicate the missing guide. They found nothing. Not a footprint, not a piece of torn clothing, not even a shell casing from his rifle. It was as if Mitty Rivers had simply stepped through an invisible doorway in the forest and closed it behind him. The search teams described an eerie quality to those November days that would echo in later disappearances. The weather was unusually calm, with none of the fierce winds that typically scoured the higher elevations. Yet searchers reported strange acoustic phenomena, voices that seemed to carry from impossible distances, the sound of footsteps that led nowhere, and an oppressive silence that fell over certain areas like a heavy blanket. One detail haunted the rescue teams. They kept finding signs that someone had been in areas they'd already searched. Fresh-looking footprints would appear in soft earth that volunteers swore they'd examined hours earlier. Broken branches at head height suggested someone had passed through clearings that had been thoroughly combed. But every lead dissolved into nothing, as if the mountain was playing an elaborate game of hide-and-seek with human lives. The Glastenbury region had been hungry for people long before Mitty Rivers went missing. Once thriving logging communities like Glastenbury and Somerset had withered and died as the timber played out, leaving behind only abandoned foundations and the skeletal remains of charcoal kilns scattered through the forest. The Bennington, Glastenbury Railroad, that ambitious 9-mile line that had once climbed 250 feet per mile up Bowless Brook, had been defunct since 1889, its rusting rails and rotting ties becoming pathways for deer and bear. By the 1940s, this was ghost town country. Fewer than a dozen residents remained in what had once been bustling mountain communities, living among the cellar holes and collapsed barns that marked where hundreds of families had tried to scratch out livings from the unforgiving landscape. The forest was reclaiming everything. Second-growth timber swallowing the evidence of human ambition with patient, inexorable hunger. Above 2,700 feet, the character of the mountain changed entirely. The hardwood forest gave way to spruce fir crumholts, where stunted trees, twisted by wind and ice, created a maze of nearly impenetrable thickets. Cold, wet fog rolled through these heights like living things, carrying the sharp scent of balsam and the promise of disorientation for anyone caught unprepared. The following spring, as snow melted from the higher elevations, a lone searcher found a single piece of evidence: Mitty River's handkerchief caught on a low branch near a stream crossing 2 miles from where he'd last been seen. The fabric was intact, unstained by weather or time, as if it had been carefully placed there rather than lost in a struggle or fall. That handkerchief raised more questions than it answered. How had Rivers traveled 2 miles through terrain that searchers had combed inch by inch? Why was this the only trace he'd left behind? And most disturbing of all, who or what had the power to make a man who knew every secret of these mountains simply cease to exist? The locals began to whisper about the old Abenaki warnings, about the mountain that consumed travelers who climbed too high or stayed too long. But rational minds insisted there had to be a logical explanation for Rivers' disappearance, some combination of injury, exposure, and bad luck that would eventually make sense. They were wrong. Rivers' vanishing was just the opening note in a symphony of impossibility that would crescendo 13 months later, when a young woman in a red coat stepped onto the long trail and walked straight into the mountain's patient embrace. But before Paula Weldon became the face of the Bennington Triangle, something else was stirring in those ancient peaks, something that seemed to be learning how to make people disappear. James E. Tedford settled into his familiar window seat on the Burlington to Bennington bus route, his weathered hands folding over the leather satchel that contained everything he owned in the world. When that Green Mountain Transit coach pulled into the Bennington terminal on December 1st, 1949, Tedford's luggage remained exactly where he'd placed it, but the 68-year-old World War I veteran had simply ceased to exist. This wasn't a case of someone vanishing in the wilderness. This was a man disappearing from a moving vehicle, filled with witnesses, defying every law of physics and logic. Tedford had been a regular passenger on this route for months, traveling back and forth between the soldiers' home in Bennington and his visits to family in St. Albans. The bus drivers knew him by name. Fellow passengers recognized his quiet demeanor and the way he always chose the same seat, 3rd row back on the right side, where he could watch the Vermont countryside roll past the frost-etched windows. That December evening carried the sharp bite of approaching winter. Fresh snow dusted the mountains, and the bus's heater worked overtime against windows that fogged with passengers' breath. Tedford had boarded in Burlington at 6:15 p.m., taking his customary seat and placing his brown leather satchel on the floor between his feet. The driver, a veteran of the route named Frank Petroselli, remembered making eye contact with Tedford in the rearview mirror as they pulled away from the terminal. The journey south toward Bennington typically took 2 hours and 45 minutes, winding through small Vermont towns where yellow streetlights created pools of warmth against the gathering darkness. Passengers dozed, read newspapers by overhead bulbs, or simply stared out at the winter landscape sliding past. It was the kind of routine evening trip where nothing memorable was supposed to happen. Multiple witnesses later confirmed that Tedford was definitely aboard when the bus made its scheduled stop in Waterbury at 7:48 p.m. A woman sitting across the aisle remembered him checking his pocket watch, an old railroad timepiece that caught the overhead light as he flipped open the silver case. The bus driver recalled seeing Tedford's reflection in the window during the brief stop as passengers shuffled on and off. 23 people were riding the coach when it departed Waterbury for the final leg to Bennington. The passenger manifest showed 23 names. The driver had counted 23 fares. But somewhere during that last hour and 12 minutes of travel through the darkness of the Green Mountains, mathematics broke down completely. When Petrocelli called Bennington Terminal, last stop, and passengers began gathering their belongings, Tedford's seat was empty. His satchel remained on the floor, undisturbed. His ticket stub lay on the seat cushion where he'd placed it. But the man himself had vanished, as completely as if he'd never existed. The other passengers were baffled. Nobody remembered seeing Tedford get up. Nobody recalled him moving toward the front of the bus. The route included several stops where passengers could disembark, but the driver was certain he would have noticed if Tedford had left. The old veteran always made a point of saying goodnight, a military courtesy that had become routine over their months of shared journeys. More puzzling still, the bus had made only 3 brief stops between Waterbury and Bennington, Montpelier, Barre, and 1 unscheduled pause when the driver pulled over to check what he thought might be a flat tire. At each stop, passengers who knew Tedford specifically remembered him remaining in his seat, that familiar silhouette visible against the window. The investigation that followed revealed details that made no logical sense. The bus had never stopped long enough for a passenger to wander away and become lost. The route followed main highways with no wilderness areas where someone could simply disappear. Most importantly, every single passenger had been accounted for at each stop. Nobody else had gotten off the bus between Waterbury and Bennington. State police examined Tedford's belongings with forensic precision. His satchel contained the typical possessions of an elderly veteran: a change of clothes, military discharge papers, a few dollars in cash, and a handful of letters from family members. Nothing suggested he'd been planning to disappear. His personal effects showed no signs of struggle or disturbance. The mystery deepened when investigators traced Tedford's background. He was a decorated Great War veteran who'd served in France, a man known for his reliability and routine habits. He'd never shown signs of mental instability or wandering behavior. His family described him as someone who always kept his appointments and never deviated from established patterns. What haunted everyone involved was the impossibility of the logistics. How does a full-grown man simply vanish from a moving vehicle without anyone noticing? The bus had windows, but they were the old-fashioned type that opened only part way, certainly not wide enough for a person to climb through, especially while traveling at highway speed. The emergency exit was in full view of other passengers, and nobody had seen it open. Local newspapers struggled to explain what had happened, finally settling on theories that ranged from unlikely to absurd. Perhaps Tedford had suffered some kind of mental episode and slipped off the bus during one of the brief stops, then wandered into the mountains. But search teams found no trace of him along the entire route, and the December cold would have made survival impossible for an elderly man in street clothes. The Bennington Evening Banner ran a front-page story with the headline, "War Veteran Vanishes from Moving Bus." But even their reporters seemed reluctant to state the obvious. James Tedford had simply ceased to exist somewhere between Waterbury and Bennington, violating every natural law that governs how people disappear. 3 years had now passed since Mitty Rivers had vanished in Bickford Hollow. 13 months since Paula Weldon had walked into the mountains wearing that red coat, and now an old soldier had managed to disappear from a sealed vehicle surrounded by witnesses. The pattern was becoming undeniable, even if nobody wanted to acknowledge it. Something in the Glastenbury mountain region was collecting people with methodical precision, taking them one by one under circumstances that defied rational explanation. But the mountain wasn't finished yet. Its hunger was growing stronger, and its next victim would be the most heartbreaking of all. A child whose disappearance would finally force the authorities to admit they were dealing with something beyond their understanding. 8-year-old Paul Jepson sprinted away from his mother's voice, calling him back to the truck, his small legs carrying him past the smoking refuse piles of the Bennington town dump towards something that caught his eye in the tree line. When Lena Jepson finished feeding the pigs and turned to collect her son for the ride home on October 12, 1950, she found only his footprints in the soft earth, leading directly toward the same cursed mountains that had already claimed 3 lives. The disappearance of a child shattered the community's last pretense that these vanishings were merely coincidental tragedies. Buddy, as everyone called him, had made this weekly trip to the dump with his mother dozens of times before. The Jepson family kept pigs on their small farm outside Bennington, and the dump provided a steady source of vegetable scraps and kitchen waste that supplemented their animals' diet. It was honest work in an era when rural Vermont families did whatever it took to survive, turning society's refuse into bacon and ham for the dinner table. The dump itself occupied a natural depression in the hills about 3 miles northeast of downtown Bennington, where trucks backed up to the edge and emptied their loads into ever-growing piles of household debris. Smoke rose constantly from spontaneous fires that smoldered through layers of organic waste, creating an acrid haze that locals had learned to ignore. It wasn't a pleasant place, but it served its purpose in an age before environmental regulations and modern waste management. Lena had backed their battered Ford pickup to the edge of the refuse area and begun the familiar routine of sorting through suitable scraps for the pigs. Buddy typically stayed close to the truck, entertaining himself by poking through interesting pieces of junk or watching the rats that scurried between the garbage piles. He was a well-behaved child, old enough to understand basic safety rules, but young enough to be fascinated by the treasures that adults threw away. That October afternoon carried the crisp bite of autumn in the Green Mountains. Maples blazed scarlet and gold on the surrounding hillsides, their colors so vivid they seemed to pulse against the deep blue sky. The air smelled of wood smoke from distant chimneys and the earthy sweetness of decomposing leaves. It should have been a perfect day for a simple errand that had become routine family business, but something caught Buddy's attention near the dump's eastern edge, where the refuse area gave way to second-growth forest. Witnesses later disagreed about what he might have seen: a flash of movement, perhaps, or something colorful among the trees that triggered a child's natural curiosity. Whatever it was, it drew him away from his mother's watchful eye with magnetic force. Lena finished loading pig scraps into the truck bed and called for Buddy to climb into the cab for the ride home. When he didn't respond immediately, she felt the first flutter of maternal concern. The dump wasn't particularly dangerous, but it wasn't a place where children should wander unsupervised. She called his name again, louder this time, her voice echoing off the surrounding hills. Silence. The search began within minutes. Lena ran through the refuse piles, calling Buddy's name, her voice growing more frantic as the minutes stretched without response. Other families at the dump joined the hunt, spreading out to cover more ground. Someone drove to the nearest telephone to call the Bennington police, while others began searching the forest edge where small footprints clearly showed Buddy had entered the woods. By sunset, more than 50 volunteers had assembled at the dump. As darkness fell, they organized into search parties, equipped with flashlights and lanterns, their beams cutting through the gathering gloom like desperate fireflies. The temperature was dropping toward freezing, and everyone understood the urgency. A small child couldn't survive. An October night in the mountains, wearing only the light jacket and cotton pants he'd put on that morning. The Bennington County Sheriff's Department brought in their best tracking dogs the following dawn. The bloodhounds immediately picked up Buddy's scent at the forest edge and followed it with confidence through the mixed hardwood forest that climbed steadily toward Glastenbury Mountain's lower slopes. The trail was clear and consistent for almost a mile, winding between massive oak and maple trees that had stood since before the first European settlers arrived. Then something impossible happened. At a crossroads, where an old logging road intersected with a deer path, the scent simply vanished. Not gradually, not confusion, where multiple trails converged. It ended as abruptly as if Buddy had been lifted straight into the air. The dogs circled frantically, whining and pawing at the ground, but they couldn't pick up even the faintest trace beyond that intersection. Professional tracking experts examined the area with scientific precision. The soil conditions were perfect for preserving scent, moist but not muddy, with minimal wind to disperse odor particles. The dogs had been following a clear trail for nearly an hour when it suddenly disappeared. In 4 decades of search and rescue work, the handlers had never encountered anything like it. The search expanded to include National Guard aircraft and hundreds of ground volunteers who formed human chains to sweep every square yard of forest within a 5-mile radius. They found nothing, no torn clothing, no footprints beyond that crossroads, no indication that an 8-year-old boy had ever existed beyond that precise spot where his scent trail ended. Local newspapers struggled to explain what had happened to Buddy Jepson, but the story that emerged painted a picture of impossible circumstances. How does a small child simply cease to exist in broad daylight? How does a scent trail something so fundamental that bloodhounds can follow it through rain, snow, and wind just stop without explanation? The community was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. This wasn't random bad luck anymore. 4 people had now vanished in the Glastenbury mountain region under circumstances that defied logical explanation. An experienced guide who knew every trail, a college student on a well-marked path, a war veteran who disappeared from a moving vehicle, and now a child who had somehow stepped out of reality itself at a forest crossroads. The pattern was becoming undeniable, even for skeptics who insisted there had to be rational explanations. Something in these mountains was systematically collecting human lives, taking them one by one with methodical precision that suggested intelligence rather than random misfortune. But the mountain's appetite wasn't satisfied yet. One more person would join this impossible catalog of disappearances, and her case would prove that whatever haunted the Glastenbury wilderness had saved its strangest performance for last. Frida Langer's boots slipped on the wet rocks beside Somerset Reservoir, sending her tumbling into the ice-cold mountain stream while her hiking companions watched in horror from the opposite bank. As she hauled herself from the water on October 28, 1950, soaked and shivering in the autumn chill, she called out that she was going back to camp to change into dry clothes, then vanished for 7 months before returning as a corpse that would rewrite everything authorities thought they knew about the Bennington Triangle. Langer's case would prove that sometimes the dead do tell tales, but only in whispers that make the living question the very nature of reality. The 53-year-old Massachusetts resident had been hiking with her cousin Herbert Elsner through the remote wilderness around Somerset Reservoir, a man-made lake nestled high in the Green Mountains about 10 miles northeast of Bennington. This was rugged country, even by Vermont standards, trackless forest, broken by granite ledges and beaver ponds, where compass readings meant more than marked trails, and a wrong turn could leave experienced hikers wandering for days. Frida was no weekend warrior. She'd been exploring New England's backcountry for decades, accumulating the kind of wilderness wisdom that came only from years of reading weather patterns, following game trails, and understanding how mountains could turn deadly without warning. Her hiking boots were worn smooth by countless miles, her pack organized with the methodical precision of someone who'd learned that preparation meant survival in places where rescue might be days away. The morning had started perfectly. October in Vermont painted the mountainsides in colors so vivid they seemed artificial scarlet maples, golden birches, and deep orange oaks, creating a tapestry that drew leaf peepers from across New England. The air carried that sharp clarity unique to autumn in the mountains, where every breath felt clean enough to bottle and every distant ridge stood out with crystalline precision. Somerset Reservoir itself was a testament to human engineering carved into an unforgiving landscape. Built in the 1920s to generate hydroelectric power, the lake flooded thousands of acres of pristine wilderness, creating a body of water that looked natural but concealed the drowned remnants of forests, farmsteads, and logging camps beneath its dark surface. The shoreline was rocky and irregular, studded with the bleached skeletons of trees that had died when the waters rose. Frida and Herbert had been following an old logging road that skirted the reservoir's eastern edge, planning to loop back to their car via a network of deer paths and abandoned wood roads. These weren't maintained hiking trails. They were faint traces left by loggers and hunters who'd worked these mountains generations earlier, requiring constant attention to avoid losing the route entirely. The stream crossing where everything went wrong was typical of dozens they'd navigated successfully that morning. Granite boulders created natural stepping stones across 15 feet of fast-moving water that drained from the higher elevations toward the reservoir below. The rocks were slick with morning condensation and scattered leaves, but nothing that should have challenged someone with Frida's experience. Yet somehow her boot found the one wet spot that couldn't provide purchase. Herbert watched her slip and fall backward into the stream with a splash that echoed off the surrounding forest. The water was shockingly cold, fed by snowmelt and underground springs that never warmed even in midsummer. Frida surfaced immediately, gasping and cursing the chill that penetrated her wool hiking clothes like liquid ice. She hauled herself onto the opposite bank, water streaming from her jacket and pants, while Herbert called across, asking if she was injured. Frida waved him off, more annoyed than hurt, and shouted that she was fine but needed to get back to their base camp to change into dry clothes before hypothermia set in. It was a sensible decision. Staying in wet clothes during an October afternoon in the mountains was a textbook path to dangerous exposure. Their camp was located about half a mile back along the trail they'd followed that morning, a small clearing where they'd pitched tents near a reliable water source. Frida knew the route perfectly, having walked it twice already that day. The path was clear, well marked by their own footprints, and led through open hardwood forest where visibility extended for hundreds of yards in every direction. Herbert offered to accompany her, but Frida insisted she'd be fine alone. She was an experienced hiker who'd changed clothes in the wilderness countless times before. The walk back to camp would actually warm her up, and she'd rejoin him within an hour wearing dry gear and ready to continue their planned loop hike. Those were the last words anyone ever heard Frida Langer speak. When she failed to return after 2 hours, Herbert retraced the route to their base camp. Her wet clothes lay in a soggy pile beside her tent, exactly where she would have dropped them. But Frida herself had vanished as completely as if she'd never existed, leaving behind only the damp evidence of her planned clothing change. The search that followed was the largest in Vermont history to that point. More than 400 volunteers, National Guard aircraft, state police investigators, and professional rescue teams scoured every square mile of forest within a 10-mile radius of Somerset Reservoir. They found nothing, no footprints, no torn clothing, no indication that Frida had ever left that base camp after removing her wet hiking gear. For 7 months, the mystery remained absolute. Frida Langer had joined the impossible catalog of Glastenbury mountain disappearances, another experienced outdoors person who'd simply ceased to exist under circumstances that defied rational explanation. Then, on May 12, 1951, hikers discovered her body. But here's what made Frida's case truly disturbing. She was found in an area that search teams had examined repeatedly during the massive hunt 7 months earlier. Not a remote location that might have been overlooked, but a prominent clearing less than half a mile from where she disappeared, a spot that dozens of searchers swore they'd investigated thoroughly. Even more unsettling, the condition of her remains suggested she'd been dead for months, not days. But medical examiners couldn't determine a cause of death. No injuries, no signs of animal predation, no indication of what had killed a healthy 53-year-old woman, who'd simply walked away to change clothes and never returned. The authorities had found their missing hiker, but her discovery only deepened the mystery that was consuming rational explanations, one impossible case at a time. Where had Frida Langer spent those 7 months between disappearance and discovery? How had her body appeared in a location that had been searched exhaustively? And what force was powerful enough to make people vanish from reality itself, only to return them as silent corpses that raised more questions than they answered? The mountain had given back one of its victims, but the gift came wrapped in riddles that would haunt investigators for decades to come. 400 searchers spread across Glastenbury Mountain's unforgiving slopes, like an army of ants, their voices calling Frida Langer's name into a wilderness that had already proven it could swallow people whole and return only silence. By May of 1951, the state of Vermont had thrown everything it possessed at finding the missing aircraft, bloodhounds, National Guard troops, and volunteer search parties that represented the largest coordinated rescue effort in the region's history. This wasn't just about finding one woman anymore. It was about confronting a mystery that threatened to undermine everything authorities thought they knew about how people disappear. The command post established at Somerset Reservoir resembled a military operation more than a typical search and rescue mission. Canvas tents housed radio equipment that crackled with constant updates from search teams scattered across 30 square miles of wilderness. Maps covered with colored pins marked every area that had been systematically examined, creating a rainbow constellation of human effort that somehow kept missing its target. State Police Captain Robert Harrington, brought in to coordinate the massive operation, had overseen dozens of missing person cases throughout his career. But he'd never encountered anything like the methodical impossibility that seemed to govern disappearances in the Glastenbury region. "It's like the mountain is playing games with us," he confided to reporters. A statement that would later be quoted extensively when Frida's body finally surfaced in an area his teams had searched repeatedly. The searchers themselves reported phenomena that defied easy explanation. Compass readings became unreliable in certain areas, with magnetic needles spinning wildly before settling on headings that led nowhere useful. Radio communications suffered strange interference patterns, with clear signals suddenly dissolving into static when teams reached specific elevations or geographic coordinates. Most unsettling of all, experienced woodsmen found themselves becoming disoriented in terrain they'd known since childhood. Aircraft pilots described visual anomalies that made accurate mapping nearly impossible. The mountains seemed to shift perspective depending on approach angle, with ridges and valleys appearing in different configurations from one flight to the next. Photography proved equally problematic. Aerial shots of the same area taken hours apart showed subtle but distinct differences in topography that couldn't be explained by lighting conditions or camera angles. The bloodhounds brought in from across New England displayed behavior that puzzled their handlers. Dogs that could normally follow week-old scent trails through rain and snow would suddenly stop dead at certain locations, whining and backing away from areas that appeared identical to everywhere else. Some refused to continue tracking entirely, cowering against their handlers as if confronting an invisible threat that triggered primordial fear responses. Local folklore offered explanations that law enforcement officials were reluctant to acknowledge publicly. The Abenaki tribes, who'd once hunted these peaks, had passed down warnings for generations about Glastenbury Mountain being cursed, home to a malevolent presence they called the man-eating stone. According to tribal tradition, the mountain summit was the place where the four winds meet, a location where spiritual barriers grew thin and unwary travelers could slip between worlds. Frontier newspapers from the early 1800s had documented sightings of what they called the Bennington monster, a large, bipedal creature that allegedly attacked stagecoaches and terrorized loggers working the remote timber operations. While skeptics dismissed such accounts as frontier superstition, the consistency of reports across different time periods suggested something genuinely unusual about the region's wildlife or atmospheric conditions. Weather patterns around Glastenbury Mountain displayed characteristics that meteorologists struggled to explain. Wind currents shifted erratically every few minutes, creating microclimates that made accurate forecasting nearly impossible. Fog banks appeared and dissipated, with no apparent correlation to atmospheric pressure or humidity levels. Most disturbingly, temperatures could vary by 20 degrees within a few hundred yards of elevation, creating thermal layers that seemed to exist independently of normal meteorological principles. The search teams working above 2,700 feet encountered environmental conditions that bordered on otherworldly. The hardwood forests gave way to spruce fir Krumholtz stunted trees, twisted by constant wind and ice into grotesque sculptures that created maze-like passages through the understory. Cold, wet fog rolled through these elevations like living things, carrying the sharp scent of balsam resin and an oppressive silence that seemed to muffle sound beyond normal acoustic principles. Veteran searchers described an almost physical sensation of being watched while working the higher elevations. Multiple team leaders reported feeling compelled to look over their shoulders constantly, despite seeing nothing unusual when they turned around. The psychological pressure was so intense that some volunteers requested reassignment to lower elevations, claiming they couldn't concentrate on their search patterns while fighting the persistent impression that something was observing their every movement. The discovery of Frida Langer's body in May finally provided authorities with physical evidence, but it only deepened the mystery rather than resolving it. The medical examiner's report was maddeningly inconclusive. No obvious cause of death, no signs of trauma or animal predation, nothing to explain how a healthy middle-aged woman had simply ceased to live. More puzzling still, the body's location in a clearing that searchers had examined repeatedly raised questions about whether they were dealing with conventional disappearances at all. By the time the Langer case was officially closed, 5 people had vanished in the Glastenbury Mountain region under circumstances that challenged every assumption about how humans disappear. 4 of them, Mitty Rivers, Paula Weldon, James Tedford, and Paul Jepson, had never been found, despite searches that represented the most extensive manhunts in Vermont history. Only Frida had returned, and her discovery raised more questions than it answered. The string of disappearances had already triggered significant changes in Vermont law enforcement. The botched handling of Paula Weldon's case had been so catastrophic that the state legislature created the Vermont State Police 7 months after her disappearance, a direct response to rural sheriff departments' inability to manage complex investigations. But even professional state investigators couldn't explain what was happening in these cursed mountains. What patterns emerged from 5 impossible cases? What did the evidence suggest about forces operating beyond the boundaries of conventional investigation? And most importantly, had the Bennington Triangle finally satisfied its hunger for human lives? Or was this merely the end of the first chapter in a much longer story? The mountain was keeping its secrets, but the world was about to learn that some mysteries grow stronger when exposed to scrutiny rather than dissolving under investigation. By 1951, investigators had mapped 5 impossible disappearances across 6 years, and the pattern that emerged challenged every assumption about how people vanish. Experienced outdoorsmen, college students, war veterans, children, and middle-aged hikers, all swallowed by the same hungry mountains under circumstances that seemed designed to mock human understanding. When folklorist Joseph A. Citro coined the term Bennington Triangle, decades later, he was giving a name to something that had already burned itself into Vermont's collective memory like a brand. The clustering wasn't random, it was methodical, surgical, and utterly inexplicable to minds trained in rational investigation. Detective work traditionally relies on finding connections between victims, but the Glastenbury Mountain disappearances seemed to actively resist such analysis. Mitty Rivers was a 74-year-old hunting guide who'd spent his entire life in these mountains. Paula Weldon was an 18-year-old college sophomore from Connecticut struggling with academic pressures. James Tedford was a 68-year-old war veteran living in a soldier's home. Paul Jepson was an 8-year-old farm boy whose world extended barely beyond Bennington's town limits. Frida Langer was a 53-year-old experienced hiker from Massachusetts. No shared backgrounds, no common associates, no overlapping social circles that might suggest a human predator targeting specific types of victims. The ages ranged from 8 to 74. 3 were male, 2 female. They came from different states, different economic classes, different life experiences. The only thing they had in common was proximity to Glastenbury Mountain when they ceased to exist. Yet certain details created an eerie resonance across the cases that couldn't be dismissed as coincidence. Both Paula Weldon and Paul Jepson had been wearing bright red coats when they vanished, a detail that locals began whispering had angered the mountain. The timing showed a disturbing pattern as well. 4 of the 5 disappearances occurred in late autumn or early winter, when the mountain's character shifted from welcoming to forbidding as temperatures dropped and daylight hours shortened. Geographic analysis revealed that all 5 vanishings had occurred within a roughly triangular area bounded by Glastenbury Mountain to the east, the town of Bennington to the south, and Somerset Reservoir to the north. This region encompassed some of Vermont's most remote and challenging terrain: abandoned logging roads, defunct railroad grades, and second-growth forests that had reclaimed once thriving communities. The elevation factor proved particularly significant. Each disappearance had occurred at or above the 2,700-foot threshold, where Vermont's hardwood forests gave way to spruce fir crumholts. Above this line, the mountain's character changed entirely, becoming a maze of stunted trees, granite ledges, and weather patterns that seemed to operate by their own rules. Local guides had always known that something felt different about the higher elevations, but they'd attributed it to normal mountain phenomena rather than supernatural forces. Search and rescue teams documented environmental anomalies that recurred across multiple cases. Compass readings became unreliable in specific areas, magnetic needles spinning wildly before settling on headings that led nowhere useful. Bloodhounds that could normally track week-old scents through rain and snow would suddenly lose trails at certain geographic coordinates, as if scent molecules simply ceased to exist beyond invisible barriers. Radio communications suffered interference patterns that technicians couldn't explain. Clear signals would dissolve into static when teams reached particular elevations, then resume normal clarity when they moved to different locations. Most unsettling, experienced searchers reported feeling physically watched while working the higher elevations, a psychological pressure so intense that some volunteers requested reassignment to lower areas. The cases generated theories that ranged from rational to ridiculous. Natural explanations included hidden cave systems that could swallow unwary hikers, thermal vents that might disorient victims, or unusual magnetic fields that could interfere with human navigation systems. More exotic possibilities suggested classified military experiments, UFO abductions, or dimensional portals that operated according to unknown scientific principles. Local folklore offered its own interpretations. The Abenaki tribes had always warned that Glastenbury Mountain was cursed, calling the summit the place where the 4 winds meet, and claiming it was home to a malevolent entity they described as the man-eating stone. Frontier newspapers from the 1800s had documented sightings of the Bennington monster, a large bipedal creature that allegedly terrorized loggers and attacked stagecoaches traveling through the region. By the 1950s, these old stories had evolved into modern legends. Local residents spoke in hushed tones about the mountain's appetite for human lives, claiming it selected victims according to mysterious criteria that outsiders couldn't understand. Some insisted the mountain was protecting ancient secrets buried in its peaks. Others believed it was punishing humans for ecological damage caused by decades of logging and development. The cultural impact extended far beyond Vermont's borders. Author Shirley Jackson channeled the Paula Weldon mystery into her 1951 novel Hangsaman, showing how quickly the disappearances had filtered into post-war American popular culture. The cases became template stories for writers, exploring themes of inexplicable loss and the limits of rational investigation. Media coverage struggled with the fundamental impossibility of what had occurred. How do you report on 5 people who had simply ceased to exist under circumstances that violated every natural law governing human disappearance? Newspapers settled on vague language about mysterious vanishings and unexplained circumstances, avoiding the obvious conclusion that something beyond conventional understanding was operating in these mountains. The Bennington Evening Banner's editorial staff coined the phrase "Lost Horizon" to describe the region, comparing its vanishings to the mythical Shangri-La, where travelers discovered hidden realms beyond normal reality. The comparison was more apt than they realized. These weren't random tragedies, but methodical collections that suggested intelligence rather than accident. Scientific analysis of the evidence revealed patterns that contradicted natural explanations. The timing was too precise, the locations too concentrated, the circumstances too consistently impossible. Whatever was happening in the Glastenbury mountain region operated according to rules that human investigation couldn't penetrate, despite deploying the most sophisticated search and rescue techniques available in the early 1950s. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Bennington Triangle wasn't what happened to the victims. It was how completely they had been erased from reality itself. No bodies, no evidence, no traces that could provide closure to families or answers to investigators. It was as if the mountain had developed an appetite for human lives and learned exactly how to satisfy it without leaving clues. The question that haunted everyone involved wasn't whether the disappearances would continue. It was whether anyone would ever understand what force was powerful enough to make people simply cease to exist in broad daylight, leaving behind only families destroyed by unanswered questions and a mountain that kept its secrets locked in granite silence. 74 years have passed since that final, terrifying phone call from the Bennington Triangle, and Glastenbury Mountain still guards its secrets with the patience of granite. But the disappearances stopped as abruptly as they had begun, leaving investigators to wonder whether they had witnessed the complete feeding cycle of something beyond human comprehension, or merely the dormant phase of a hunger that might someday awaken again. This wasn't just a regional mystery that faded with time. It became the template for understanding how entire categories of people can simply cease to exist, influencing decades of paranormal investigation and establishing patterns that researchers still use to identify similar phenomena worldwide. The immediate aftermath of the Bennington Triangle cases reshaped Vermont law enforcement permanently. The botched investigation of Paula Weldon's disappearance had been so catastrophic that it triggered the creation of the Vermont State Police in 1947, a direct legislative response to rural sheriff departments' inability to handle complex missing person cases. Professional investigators replaced local volunteers, standardized search protocols, replaced improvised efforts, and scientific methodology replaced intuition-based detective work. But even modern law enforcement techniques couldn't explain what had happened during those 5 impossible years. State police cold case files from the 1960s and 70s show investigators repeatedly reopening the Glastenbury mountain disappearances, applying new forensic technologies and investigative methods to evidence that refused to yield rational explanations. Every advancement in search and rescue capabilities, every improvement in evidence analysis, only deepened the mystery rather than solving it. The geographic heart of the disappearances, that triangular region bounded by Glastenbury Mountain, Bennington, and Somerset Reservoir, became a magnet for paranormal investigators, amateur sleuths, and curiosity seekers drawn by the impossibility of what had occurred. Modern hiking groups regularly explore the same trails where Paula Weldon vanished, following GPS coordinates that guide them to the exact spots where scent trails ended and reality seemed to fracture. Contemporary search and rescue technology would have made 1950s investigations seem primitive by comparison. Satellite imagery, thermal detection systems, ground-penetrating radar, and DNA analysis represent quantum leaps in capability that should theoretically make unexplained disappearances impossible. Yet hikers still report unsettling experiences on Glastenbury mountain compass malfunctions, GPS devices that provide contradictory readings, and that persistent sensation of being observed while traversing the higher elevations. The cultural legacy extends far beyond Vermont's borders. The Bennington Triangle cases established the template for cluster disappearances that researchers now identify worldwide: the Alaska Triangle, the Michigan Triangle, and dozens of other regions where people vanish under circumstances that defy conventional explanation. Each follows similar patterns: experienced outdoors people disappearing in familiar territory, search efforts that yield impossible results, and evidence that suggests forces operating beyond normal physical laws. Modern theories attempting to explain the disappearances range from scientifically plausible to utterly speculative. Geological explanations focus on unique magnetic field variations that could disorient navigation systems, both natural and electronic. Atmospheric theories suggest temperature inversions and unusual wind patterns that might create disorientation effects strong enough to cause experienced hikers to become fatally lost in familiar terrain. More exotic possibilities include dimensional portal theories borrowed from theoretical physics, suggesting that certain geographic locations might serve as gateways between parallel realities. Underground cave systems remain a popular explanation, though geological surveys have never identified formations large enough to account for complete disappearances. Military explanations propose classified experiments conducted during the Cold War, though declassified documents reveal no evidence of government operations in the Glastenbury region during the critical years. The mountain itself has changed dramatically since the 1950s. Climate change has shifted vegetation patterns, pushing hardwood forests higher up the slopes and altering the character of elevations where the disappearances occurred. Development pressure has brought hiking trails, cellular towers, and satellite coverage to areas that were truly wilderness when Mitty Rivers guided his final hunting party into Bickford Hollow. Yet something indefinable about the region remains unchanged. Local guides still report feeling uneasy while working the higher elevations. Hikers describe acoustic anomalies, where voices seem to carry from impossible distances or where normal forest sounds create unsettling harmonics. The psychological pressure that 1950 searchers described as feeling watched continues to affect modern visitors, suggesting that whatever once operated in these mountains might still be present, dormant, rather than destroyed. The families of the disappeared never received closure. Mitty Rivers, Paula Weldon, James Tedford, and Paul Jepson remain missing persons in official records, their cases technically still open despite decades without new evidence. Only Frida Langer's family achieved the bitter resolution of recovery, though her mysterious reappearance in a previously searched area raised more questions than it answered about the forces that had briefly claimed her life. Amateur investigators continue probing the cases using modern technology and fresh perspectives. Internet forums dedicated to the Bennington Triangle generate thousands of posts analyzing every detail, proposing new theories, and sharing contemporary experiences from visitors to the area. Some researchers claim to have identified additional disappearances from the same time period that weren't properly documented by overwhelmed local authorities. The enduring power of the Bennington Triangle lies not in what we know, but in what we can never know. 5 people stepped into Vermont wilderness and simply ceased to exist, leaving behind only questions that challenge our fundamental assumptions about reality itself. Their disappearances created ripples that continue spreading through law enforcement training, search and rescue protocols, and popular culture's fascination with unsolved mysteries. What force was powerful enough to make experienced outdoors people vanish without leaving traces? Why did the disappearances cluster in such a specific time period and geographic area? And perhaps most unsettling of all, could whatever consumed those 5 lives still be waiting in the granite peaks and shadowed valleys of Glastenbury Mountain, patient as stone and hungry as eternity? The mountain keeps its secrets, but every hiker who walks those trails, every investigator who studies those files, and every family member who still wonders what happened to their loved ones, carries forward the essential mystery that transforms the Bennington Triangle from historical curiosity into timeless warning about the limits of human understanding. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even stranger. Subscribe before it drops.